Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Raylene King. I'm the court administrator for the city of Blaine and small cities representative. Today, Dan Hamill and Mike Parker are the co-chairs for the behavioral health, and Arlene Feld and I are the co-chairs for the legal and justice subcommittee. We'll be calling this meeting to order. It is 11:33 a.m. It's the Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force Joint Behavioral Health and Legal and Justice Committee. And to begin, I will read the land acknowledgement statement. Before we begin, we acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lummi, Nooksack, Samish, and Semiahmoo people who have cared for and tended this land since time immemorial. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. And please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. The beginning of this meeting, we've got the call to order and the domestic violence offender treatment. And I do have Amy Roberts here, so I want to jump right in to get this portion of the meeting, because she may be able to assist us in some of the questions we all may have. Over the last several months, the Legal and Justice Subcommittee has been discussing concerns about violence in the criminal justice system. Bruce Van Glupt and Jake Bush with Whatcom County District Court Probation spoke about current programs provided and the DV PLOTS program offered by Whatcom County, as well as funding for low-income individuals needing treatment. At our last meeting, Amy Roberts, who is the DV Treatment Program Manager for Department of Social Health Services, spoke about the new and old treatment standards, as well as concerns for programs offered to those who are unable to afford the state-mandated treatment programs. Other concerns that have been brought to my attention and others are the lack of state-certified DV treatment providers, and I want to add in there Don Stahl with Waterfront Counseling, who's one of the largest providers, is retiring and closing his office, so we will be losing that. Lack of funding for mandated treatment, as it is not covered by insurance. So mental health and drug treatment, alcohol treatment is usually covered by insurance, but domestic violence treatment that can be mandated by the courts is not. Inequity in treatment and legal applications for those who are unable to afford treatment. Cultural and ethnic barriers for treatment, as well as language access for individuals wanting to get treatment. Victim assistance concerns. We have attorneys that will help, and we have a domestic violence victims advocate that helps in the small cities, and DVSAS helps in counties. But we do have concerns about those individuals getting adequate help with parenting plans and civil stuff. There's different avenues, and that's been brought to my attention by one of the other small cities. Temporary housing and financial assistance for victims or defendants. New police reform laws bring new concerns for domestic violence victims. The question on the table is, what do our committees want to request the task force do as a whole to attempt to resolve any of the issues? One thought that was brought to my attention is trying to change the WAC to require insurance to cover treatment for all in need, not just when it's alcohol and mental health. If this happens, it may open more treatment agencies for certification in the domestic violence field, as they know that they would most likely get paid. Are we able to provide scholarships to individuals going into the mental health field if they stay in our state? If so, what would our minimum requirements be, and how would we go about doing that? Can we assist in making mental health and domestic violence providers with financial incentives to come to our area? Treatment should be accessible to all, not those that are able to afford it. When an individual is booked, they may be homeless and unemployed due to a mandatory arrest. This may put a financial burden on the defendants as well as the family that was being supported. We don't want victims to be afraid to report a crime, as now they may be left without anything. So that's kind of a summary of what's been going on over the last couple of months. I'm opening this up to the committee members, and I would like to hear from Amy Roberts if she has anything that she can add, as I know that she has to leave shortly after this meeting starts. So Amy, if you have any additional input that you can help us with or give us direction, we'd greatly appreciate it.
Sure, I'll just start off by saying that substance use treatment was in the same boat that we are currently before the insurance companies started covering that. And what it would take to do that, from my understanding, the way it's been explained to me, is the state insurance commissioner would have to get on board with that and require insurance companies in Washington state to cover domestic violence treatment. And then they would go through a process of figuring out rates and things like that. I don't believe that's something I can do with a whack change. I'm sure I can't. So that's a little bit of info on how that would work. And that's something statewide that the Gender and Justice Committee that convened through House Bill 1517 discussed at great length, was how do we do something like that? Or is there a way that we can ask for state funding for this? So those were discussions that have been going on for about 4 or 5 years now. And so far, I don't think any movement has happened on either of those fronts. So I did talk to Jake and Bruce about another DV treatment provider that's interested in moving into the area perhaps. And so they have her contact information. And I'm not sure if they've been able to get a hold of her yet. Maybe they can update us on that.
Yes, this is Bruce Van Glupt, District Court and Adult Probation. Thank you, Amy. We did get in touch with that agency, had a nice long discussion. We forwarded the DV POTS implementation guide to her. And for those of you that aren't familiar, DV POTS stands for Domestic Violence Perpetrator Opportunity for Services. And it is the funding source provided by the City of Bellingham and Whatcom County that allows indigent defendants to have a DV assessment and treatment paid for. We talked with her about how it's been working since we launched almost a year ago. We also talked to her about the legal contract between the county and the agency and how that all works. And she talked about her programs, not just domestic violence, but she also offers in some of her locations, mental health treatment, and I believe also sex offender treatment. Which of those she might move into the Bellingham area, we don't know. I don't believe she has an office on the west side yet. We also talked about the possibility, at least until the pandemic is resolved, that because she is doing remote DV treatment right now, she's in some of the counties that don't have any. She gets referrals from, I believe, some counties that don't have any DV agency at all within the jurisdiction. So she's offering remote services, and we talked to her about that and the possibility that we could get her on board with that, with our funding for the defendants that qualify for our funding from Whatcom County. So we did have a nice discussion with her. So the next step in that is she was going to review the implementation guide, and then we'll be back in touch. And if it's something she's interested in pursuing or being involved in, we will definitely get working on the contract with her.
Thank you, Bruce. Amy, do you have any other comments, feedback, ideas that our committees could be working on to solve some of the issues that we have?
The only other idea that I have that I may not have brought up in the bigger group here is the idea of recruiting students who are already enrolled at university on a counseling track to go into domestic violence treatment. And that would include recruiting bachelor's level psychology and social work folks. You would be able to take someone, and kind of plug them in as an intern, hypothetically, with a provider you already have in the area, and get them the experience and hours they need to open their own place eventually, if they would like to do that, or if they're interested in pursuing the work. Most counseling students just don't know about domestic violence treatment. They don't know that it's an option, that it exists. And if I was more than one person in my office, I'd be out there right now doing that. But right now I'm just me. So I would encourage each area to reach out to their existing students to inform them about what it is, and maybe work hand in hand with the provider you do have already in presenting to those students.
Thank you, Amy. I see Stephen's hand raised.
Question for Amy. Amy, in this task force, in a number of areas, we've found some very useful guidance from surveying what other jurisdictions across the country have done with similar problems. I mean, this can't be a unique Washington or Whatcom County issue. Are you aware of any other constructive steps in terms of certification, insurance coverage, workforce issues, effective programming that other areas have utilized?
To my knowledge, most areas do a private pay program, and some areas in some states do have some funding, usually through the county where they're at. I believe it was like somewhere in Chicago, the major county there. I was speaking to the person there who oversaw domestic violence treatment, and she said their county had funding for that, but not outside of their county. So it sounds to me like there's not a lot of statewide funding or organizing around it. Washington State is one of the few states that has such a robust set of standards for treatment. And I wish I could say we also have funding for treatment. We're just not there yet. So yeah, I think it's being done on a county level. I will say also that countrywide, we have a shortage of counselors doing any kind of work. So there are a lot more clients than there are counselors to take them in at this point. There's a huge shortage. I know counseling programs are offering huge sign-on bonuses just to get a counselor in the door. So we're competing with that as well. It's hard to talk someone into going into domestic violence treatment where they might make, $50 a week per client when they're going to get a $10,000 sign-on bonus to go work community mental health somewhere or for a private agency somewhere. So that's countrywide.
Thank you, Amy. I saw Mike Parker did have his hand up, and I see Dan Hamill.
Go ahead, Dan.
Okay. So this seems to be the perennial issue. It's workforce related. We're seeing this over on the behavioral health specialist side when we're trying to do recruitment for alternate response team for unarmed response in Bellingham. And so it's just really tough. The way I see it, there's perhaps two different paths that we could take here or recommend to take. And one is to incentivize current providers from other areas to set up shop and hang their shingle here. And that would be through some kind of financial incentive. And then what Amy was referring to in terms of basically building the pipeline. So not just filling it, but actually building it. And that is structural to me, and that is to invest in a long-term strategy on getting those students in the direction of this type of treatment. I would also like to see that on the behavioral health specialist side as well, since there's just a dearth of people. No one wants to do the work. It's hard work. It doesn't pay very well. So I think build a pipeline and then incent through financial means. And my understanding was that the state standards are not stringent enough, and the outcomes aren't positive in terms of what we really need. And I know I'm hearing two different things here, so I'm trying to reconcile that as well. And that information was provided to me by the Whatcom County Health Department, that the standards aren't where they need to be.
Well, I'll say that the standards are the most robust standards I've seen in the country besides Colorado. So I know they were, I would say they were lacking before we revised them, before we replaced them. And it's been, what, 2.5, 3 years since we replaced them. So we require a lot more training and experience, and specifically victim training and victim experience for our providers. And we also have a really robust assessment that is hard on our providers to do, honestly, at this point. I think we raised the standard to the point that we could, and maybe a little bit further than we could, given that there's no funding for them and that they don't get paid for meeting the larger standard now, the higher standard. The only incentive was to stay certified through the state. But yeah, the standards are really robust compared to the rest of the country. I'd love to see some federal standards and maybe some accreditation standards nationwide, but I think we're far away from that as well.
Darlene?
I was just going to mention that we've talked over the years about Western Washington University here in our county. Kristen Anderson, who is a professor up there at Western Washington University, has had a lot of interest. She did an internship with Bellingham Municipal Court in the prosecutor's office for about 6 months, several years ago. So that might be a resource. Part of the problem is they don't have a very robust master's program, graduate program, but that might be a resource that we want to look into at some point.
Thank you, Darlene. Mike?
I was just going to offer too that folks on this call may be aware, but Whatcom Community College is looking at doing a bachelor's of social work. And I'm actually attending a listening session this afternoon, so I'll be sure to pass this along, and the importance of this particular track, this niche track within social work. But I wanted some time just to think, because I'm looking a little bit at the data, and this is a little bit more broad than this discussion. My observation is more broad. What I looked at as I saw a precipitous drop in cases. I'm not seeing that we're not responding to calls or we're not prosecuting in any great numbers. And I wondered if I would see that. And I'm just curious, because we've got some law enforcement professionals with us today. What we're seeing nationwide is a severe spike in domestic violence issues. The pandemic is causing huge issues. But what I'm seeing in the data is it that people are just not calling to report? Do we have a serious issue with underreporting? And I'm just curious, from law enforcement standpoint, is that what you're seeing as well? And what I'm seeing is numbers actually going down, right? As we understand that domestic violence issues are actually massively on the increase. And the 2 years of data that are before us this morning, they're not pointing to that. They're really pointing that this would be going away. But I'm curious as to what people's observations are.
I can just speak on behalf of the sheriff's office. I think last year obviously was unprecedented, and I think there was some underreporting going on last year. But again, we did see, I wouldn't say we saw a significant decrease in the number of domestic, at least verbal domestics. I think Prosecutor Ritchie had put forward some stats as far as what was actually going through the court system, and he may be able to speak on that a little further. But I'm not sure if it was just because of the pandemic we saw some of that underreporting last year.
Mike, just to add, I did get some more data. I just haven't been able to screen scrape some of the information that I can't release, because AOC was helping me with some of that. And I also talked to the domestic violence victims advocate, and something we do see across the board is a lot of these individuals are arrested multiple times in different jurisdictions. They may start out at Blaine and then they end up in Bellingham because there was a restraining order and they couldn't live in Blaine anymore. And then they get a new charge in the new city and they may end up with felony charges. So you may see the same individual getting arrested multiple times in different jurisdictions. that do increase to the felony world after they may have started at the misdemeanor level. I also was told that there could be some issues with people staying home on the pandemic. Sometimes children are involved and may report that or talk to their teachers. That's definitely a problem when the children weren't going to school. I do see that the numbers actually from the data that I got from AOC for year to date, they will actually increase past what we did have for 2020. And Judge Freeman is also on this call. He has pro temp for a lot of the municipal courts and now is sitting on the Superior Court. I was wondering if you had any information on what you've seen over the years that might be able to address some of Mike Parker's questions.
Well, as far as numbers, I probably am not the best person to answer that question. I can only say just generally what I've seen over the last 2 years in Superior Court. And I'm looking at the numbers sent yesterday by Mr. Ritchie as well. And it reflects kind of my general understanding is that in Superior Court, I don't think we've had a decrease at all in 2021. I think the numbers to date are a little bit lower, but generally throughout the pandemic, I think we've seen a pretty consistent stream of felony level offenses as years passed. My experience with the municipal courts is probably a little dated at this point. So I'm not entirely sure. I've kind of looked over the numbers and I see some of the more active courts throughout the pandemic are probably running steady with what they've had previously. And some of the others might be down a bit this year. But again, my experience there is probably a little bit more dated.
Thank you.
I don't know if Mr. Ritchie can kind of expand on the felony level offenses, but to me, it looks like our numbers are either consistent or going to run higher.
Right. So I think things are looking pretty consistent. Outside of that, I don't have a whole lot of speculation as to what's going on out there. The numbers speak for themselves, and I'll end with that.
Thank you, Eric. Arlene, I see your hands raised.
Yes, I was curious. I was trying to understand the statistics in comparison with the treaters that we have for people who are diverted. So I'm looking at those numbers, and those numbers are in the hundreds sometimes. And there's currently, according to what you said today, one person is serving treatment. I wonder what you think about that.
Arlene, a brief correction, and I'm hoping that Jake or Bruce can chime in on this to make sure I'm accurate, but Don Stahl is retiring, and he is one of the biggest providers that is used in this county. We do have 5, including him, that were domestic violence treatment providers that are state certified, 2 that we use, Don in particular, and then there's one other one, and then there's one out in Lummi. And Jake, if you could chime in on the other 2.
Sure.
But primarily, we've got the state mandated, and we've got a lot of people that can't go to the state mandate because they can't afford it.
I can speak. Don Stahl at Waterfront Counseling, he's taken probably the bulk of our referrals, or probably at least over half. And so he'll be closing the end of the month here. We also have relationship resources. And then with Lummi, behavioral health offers services to tribal members only. The place in Linden, I think Raylene, you were talking about, Arise Counseling, is actually also closing to domestic violence treatment. They're going to be remained open, but only for mental health services. So I will also add that, yeah, there are a handful, there's a lot of referrals, obviously, that are on here. And I will say that many of these do resolve also, with alcohol, drug treatment or mental health treatment or other directions. So not just because they come to the court do they all get domestic violence treatment, but a lot of them do get that. I just wanted to add that as well.
Thank you, Jake Freeman, Judge Freeman.
Yeah, I'll just add, again, personal experience. Don Stahl was by far the person I saw the most in municipal court, Superior Court. That's who I have seen largely the referrals for in domestic cases. It has been a problem, at least as long as I've been a pro tem on the bench, just availability of resources as well as the financial aspects of it. I mean, people that can afford to get the evaluation are obviously resolving their cases sooner. I can't tell you how many times we had cases that were continued just for individuals to be able to afford to get the evaluation. So I know this is well discussed and this is something that we're all aware of, but saw firsthand for almost a decade of pro tem work, kind of the financial impact this has on both defendants as well as families. I would also add just a reminder that this does impact outside of the criminal law sphere as well. We do see this on domestic, as far as protection order cases, where it can be ordered, as well as dissolutions. And, you know, Mr. Stahl retiring is going to have an impact on availability in those cases as well. And again, the financial aspects certainly play a factor in the civil cases as they do the criminal.
Thank you, Judge Freeman. Stephen Gockley?
We may have asked this or answered it before, but I don't recall, so I ask it again. What data are we aware of on the effectiveness of perpetrator treatment and the length of treatment that's required versus what's required to have an effective outcome? You know, I know drug court is one of the things that goes both ways with the effectiveness of our drug court is that we have a pretty rigorous long-term involvement required, whereas we could cycle people through quicker, but we wouldn't get as good an outcome necessarily. So I'm just wondering what data we're aware of or where we might get some data on the effectiveness of this before we go too far down the road with trying to expand something that may or may not work very well.
Stephen, I believe at our last meeting, Amy Roberts came up with some of the data on effectiveness on the new state mandated treatment programs, and we might be able to pull that up. I don't know if Jill still has that or not, but that might be helpful. If not, I can make sure I get that to you. I believe Arlene has her hand up and Mike Parker also has his hand. Correct.
Yeah, yes, I just read it this morning. It's quite a long article, but extremely thorough about the research. And what I recall from the article, it covered so many different things, but it said that about 20 to 25% of people treated, the treatment was ineffective. It did not succeed. But if you look at it the other way, if you see it as 75% of the programs were effective in terms of reducing any repetition of the behavior or reducing the amount of verbal abuse and so forth in the families, then, you know, to me, that's pretty effective. And I'm not surprised that a certain percentage of the people are not treatable because given certain mental illness conditions, there are sometimes no interventions that are going to alter the way things go.
Is that article something that we could have Jill distribute to us?
Yeah, I read it online. I mean, in one of our emails. I was just going back through trying to find certain.
Okay, then I will find that also then. Thanks, Arlene.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sure we all know, but the Bellingham Whatcom Commission Against Domestic Violence probably tackles this issue, you know, as part of its bread and butter substance. They might be able to, one, answer questions, and two, maybe continue any discussion that we're not able to capture here in this particular committee, but just kind of honoring their leadership in there, and also that they may be a great data mine. Another thought that I had was, you know, there are multiple things affecting how many people are coming into our jails or that a police are even able to see during COVID that could have a downward effect. And I guess, Raylene, you brought up, what would the output of the committee be regarding our observations, right? Of whether that be, as Dan described, the dearth of treatment options. We know that people are retiring. Just to add to that, if nationwide is what we're hearing, that there's actually an increase in domestic violence and our numbers are either holding steady or declining, I think if we're going to give a recommendation regarding treatment options, we need to push for bigger. My hunch is that we're not having people report as much. And we've had booking restrictions going along these past 2 years of stats that we just saw. So it's possible that if things were really reported as much as they were happening, if we were really able to respond to them as we would without pandemic, the numbers would be even greater. And I guess my point is then the need for effective perpetrator treatment will not only be as big as we see it, but more importantly, be even bigger than we see it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Moonwater?
Hi, thank you, Mike. And just to acknowledge to this group, because I don't think that everyone is aware, my understanding is that as a member of the DV Commission with some recent communication, that the DV Commission is essentially on hiatus at the moment with the departure of the director and the other staff going on leave. So that entity, I don't think, is going to be in a position in the coming months to be able to provide some extra leadership at this point in time. So it just seems important to convey that update to the group.
Thank you. I do know one of the things that there was a couple things that got brought to my attention just recently. I know that there's a felony case in an individual that has been charged for a threat. I believe this was a Bellingham case. I brought it up at the last meeting, and there wasn't a pursuit available, and he ended up getting picked up at a gun shop in Skagit Valley, and the article was in the Bellingham Herald. And the concerns are with the new police reform laws that victims may be more hesitant to report a crime of domestic violence, knowing that they may not be protected, or that the individual may be running free because it doesn't meet certain requirements for an officer to pursue that individual. And so that is a concern that was brought up to me. And one other item that was brought up by one of the small city managers was that he was concerned about adequate legal assistance for those victims that are going through the civil process of a parenting plan and dissolution. And so I brought that up to one of the defense counsels that I'm familiar with, and he said, unfortunately, there's not a lot of money in that. Paula McLandis did it for a while, and it wasn't anything to gain funds on. It was just because she was a kind person and was helping those individuals. The Whatcom Law Advocates Program, maybe somewhere we can reach out to make sure that there is a position maybe that's funded to help those people. But it definitely does still come back to providing treatment and assistance, and that we have a lack of providers. Dan, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I'm wondering if one of the recommendations that we could come up with here as a group would be to ask our state representatives to redefine allowable triggers for pursuit. It seemed like that case that you brought up, Raylene, was it was, I don't know, it just seemed like a really unnecessary close call for the other members of that household. And so I'm just wondering, they're going to go back in this next session and have claimed that they're going to work on some of these laws that they passed to make some corrections or alterations. And I think that that's got to be done. And I would want to, I would want us to look at what we think should be changed when it comes to those to that 12 or 13 or however many laws that were passed last session.
Thank you, Dan. I concur. Eric Ritchie?
Yeah, I support that idea. I'll tell you, I've been in some talks with the legislators locally, and I think that would make sense. They'd like to hear from us. I can tell you that they are speaking to law enforcement currently, and I think that support from us would help push them in the right direction. So yeah, it sounds like a fantastic idea. Thank you, Dan.
Looking for any other comments from any of the members in reference to this topic, any direction that you would like us to see go. And I would definitely think we need to bring that to the task force. And Dan, I see your hands up.
Sorry, I didn't mean to be chatty Cathy. I've had like 3 cups of coffee this morning. So I want to make that last item actionable. So it gets assigned to one of the committees, either legal and justice or behavioral health. But I don't want to leave that one sitting there. I want to make sure that we address that.
Right. So I was going to suggest that we get a small committee together to talk about it. Of course, include law enforcement. I can tell you that I had my own ideas about how pursuit should be changed, and frankly, I think there's a couple more that we should be talking about as well. But after talking to law enforcement officers, I didn't have a full picture of what needs to happen. So, if we had some of the members here in that committee, we would be, I think, able to come up with something that's important and doable.
My next question would be to Jill to see if can we create a small committee to bring that forward to the next task force meeting, or does that have to be done in one of our subcommittees?
I think if a small group of less than a quorum of members of any committee want to get together and draft something, they are certainly able to do that.
Thank you. Do I have participants that are willing to join a small group? I see Eric, I see Dan, I see Doug, I see Maya. Am I missing anybody? I'd be happy to jump on that bandwagon just to make sure we're not missing anything, as long as that's not too many people. Do we have any dates or times that we need to make this happen?
I think we have quite a bit of time. I think Dan was right. This is something that's going to be going back to the next session. However, I don't want it to drop, just like Dan doesn't want it to drop. So, I'd say within the next couple of weeks, we should have a meeting with this group.
I just want to let all of you know, if you haven't heard yet, Representatives Shoemake and Rammel will be at the next task force meeting to discuss these issues specifically. So if you do get a chance to prepare some draft recommendations before the meeting next week, let me know, forward those to me and I can send them around to everyone.
Great.
I would add they wouldn't even need to be as far along as a draft recommendation, just simply to communicate to them the areas that we're beginning conversations about making changes or suggesting changes. Probably would be helpful to keep them in the loop early on.
So Stephen, if we just request this be brought up at the next task force meeting, and that we're looking at drafting something and then we can meet after that meeting, do we need a motion on that, or can we just proceed with making sure that it's on the agenda for the next meeting?
We have a fairly broad and open-ended item on the agenda, which would be a conversation with law enforcement, Prosecutor Ritchie, Representatives Shoemake and Rammel, to try to get all the law enforcement, the legal, the legislative perspectives in the same room talking about this. I think that conversation is already on the agenda, and I would just encourage people to contribute to that conversation in the ways that we're talking about here, identifying issues for further exploration or particular viewpoints on those issues. I don't think we need a separate agenda item.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephen. Anne?
I apologize. I came in late. I was at a council meeting. And so I may have, maybe saying something that's duplicative, but if this is around some of the police reform laws and other issues related to that, I wanted to make sure that this committee was aware that our mobile crisis outreach team, which consists of both the designated crisis responders as well as those who are doing voluntary crisis response services for people with experiencing behavioral health crises, are starting to reconsider their work, that it has changed in a way that they were not hired for, and that they are being called into situations that don't really fit into their roles. And I think I want to make sure that we are very thoughtful locally to ensure against losing that critical workforce. So that's just my comment.
I have to ask a question what you're talking about exactly, Anne, because I'm familiar with some of the issues where they're not being supported by law enforcement in the way that they used to be, but I'm wondering if there's more to it than that. Can you tell us?
There's more to it than that. So certainly feeling like they're being sent into situations where there's too much unknown. Typically they have up to 2 hours to respond. And within that 2-hour time frame, they do a lot of research to make sure they know who they're responding to, what the issues are, and help set up some safety parameters. Excuse me. But I think they're also concerned about being called to situations that may not even have anything to do with behavioral health. They are truly behavioral health responders. They're master's level clinicians who do this work. So when they're being asked to respond to somebody who may be a welfare check, for instance, sleeping on a sidewalk, you know, if it's not a behavioral health issue, there isn't a reason for them to be doing that work, and it isn't the work we've asked them to do. We need them to work at their very highest level of clinical expertise. So sometimes, you know, they're just being called out because law enforcement won't go, and yet it has nothing to do with their scope of work.
Okay, well, it sounds like we have a gap then, because that's not necessarily traditional law enforcement work either. I mean, well, I shouldn't say traditional. It's not necessarily law enforcement work based on our new statutes. So, you know, it sounds like we have a real gap here.
Which is why the alternative response team is exactly the coverage. It's supposed to be a non-emergent response model that isn't necessarily behavioral health in nature. Certainly there's some to that, but that really covers that gap. So that's the model. That's how it's been designed. At this point, it's just a matter of rolling it out. But that would be the team appropriate. In the meantime, I want to make sure that we don't burn out and lose these critical people in our system.
Thank you, Anne and Eric. And just a side note, I can kind of understand, as I was going into the jail at the end of August on Tuesday morning, there was an individual sleeping in their sleeping bag, all covered up, laying in front of the jail doorway that I had to go through. They weren't committing a crime. Whether or not they chose to be there or another location, I don't know. I didn't wake him up or her up to find out what their status was. But, you know, it's definitely a different concern when I'm walking into a facility for work purposes and I expect certain things, but wasn't expecting to walk past somebody sleeping in front of the doorway. And so you don't call police, they're not committing a crime. Do you call a behavioral health specialist? I don't believe so. But then as I'm walking out to my car, there's also somebody walking in circles talking to themselves by my door at a local attorney's office. So I personally, regardless of my job or what I'm doing, am seeing more mentally or individuals that are in need of help and giving them the direction of what do we need to help those people to feel safe and comfortable moving about our day-to-day lives. And there's a lot of people concerned about it. And Dan, I see your hands up.
Yeah, just expanding a little bit on what you just said, Raylene. So I work downtown. My wife and I spend a lot of time going to restaurants and things like that. What I've noticed anecdotally over the past several months is exactly what you're talking about. A lot of people sleeping on sidewalks in places that are just very kind of unusual for people to sleep. And on a recent ride along with Captain Joe Frank and Andrea Day from Community Paramedic and Grace Program, Captain Frank said that there's some new drugs on the street called Hulkies and school buses, and they are benzodiazepine and fentanyl combined, where the dealer will buy a on Amazon and then combine those two drugs. And I'm wondering if we know anything about how that may be contributing to this, like I said, only anecdotal observations of more people sleeping. And if those people need help, I want to be sure to get them the help that they need. As was stated, they're not committing a crime, but if they are having a medical need or a behavioral health need, do we address it? Are we addressing it? And how do we do that?
So this is Anna. Let me say this. So scientifically speaking, there's two different categories of central nervous system depressants, the opiate category and then the sedative hypnotics. That combination that you just said is very dangerous because when you use both at the same time, they have not just a cumulative effect, but a much more intense effect. And that's why people die when they take opiates and alcohol, for instance. So I think the real question, and I think the education for all of us as we move forward, is what is it that we expect a behavioral health professional can do, and can they really be effective? And in order for them to be effective in an outreach situation, they need to have a brain on the other side that they can connect with. And hopefully once connect, then engage with. If somebody is significantly under the influence and really can't use their prefrontal cortex for thinking and engaging in a interaction, or if they are fluidly psychotic and just too disabled to use, again, their cognitive functioning, then you're going to have a situation where a behavioral health professional doesn't have much to offer. And then even an alternative response team isn't going to offer much. You know, there's just not much effective. And then it's about what laws do we have to help get that person to help, even though they may not be asking for it or consenting to it.
Right. That's something that we need to talk to the legislature about. But I did want to add something that I don't want to, get too ahead of ourselves. But we are planning on expanding the LEAD program. We believe that we're getting a pretty significant grant, and we have some plans. I just wanted everybody here to be aware of that. When we start talking about some of the other programs, I want to be able to make sure that everything is kind of interconnected. I think that's real important when we're talking about getting services to members in our community. Of course, we work with Grace. LEAD is connected, and Grace is well aware of what we're doing. But we are planning on expanding with a significant grant.
What will you be doing in your expansion, Eric?
Well, that's we're going to be hiring more caseworkers. I can tell you that. We're going to hopefully we will be going 7 days a week. Hopefully we'll be able to go 24/7. And I'm really, what I'm thinking about as we're talking is about how people get connected into the LEAD program and people get the services. As Dan was talking about, people sleeping on the streets and places they shouldn't be. Raylene mentioned that too. It might be possible for a phone call to a LEAD counselor to be made to make sure that that person's getting help and hopefully removed from that situation. So that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, just two brief observations about the folks in doorways and kind of the recent increase. Obviously that type of addiction, that type of use happens all over. We see it though when the person's unhoused. And when it happens behind closed doors, which it does in every neighborhood in Bellingham, there are people making choices and experiencing addiction and the ills of that. The examples that we see though are folks because they're homeless. And I would just offer that one of the solutions should be connecting a person to lead and helpful resources that includes a pathway to housing. And I think our community, there's been some great conversations trying to connect GRACE and LEAD participants. How can we attach housing to some of these options for people? Because so many of the folks, not everybody, that you see on the street or that railing that you had to walk by, not all those people are unhoused, but the vast majority are. And so just wearing that housing hat, I think there's ways though to be strategic and targeting about with our housing resources. And I would love to see more opportunities where we pair those things together. So if the person is connected to LEAD or GRACE, and they're also homeless, that we work like the Dickens in this community to try to pair that to housing. Because if we really want that program to be as robust and they have keep those great stats, we're gonna have to house these people so they don't have to be in the doorway anymore. And I think ARPA, by the way, and I hope we get to that discussion today, could be a pathway, could be an opportunity possibly to increase some housing opportunities for some of these very folks that we're talking about today. Thanks.
Mike, I appreciate your comments and I concur wholeheartedly. I'd also like to see housing for individuals that may have been incarcerated on domestic violence and no longer can go home, which could lead to addiction and issues that they may not have had because now they may have lost their job, they may not have a home to go home to due to restraining order, and to get them the help and the treatment so the victims aren't left in the cold as well. I see Arlene's hand up and I don't want to continue on this route for too much longer because we have a lot more on the agenda and I want Dan and Mike to take part in moving us forward, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Arlene first. Thank you.
Arlene, you're muted.
Okay, just a brief mention that the North Sound Behavioral Health Organization is processing more funding for assisted housing, and that it's important to know that this money can be accessed, in particular to Mike or any other person who's looking for housing resources. My point is that money is coming.
Thank you. Dan Hamill and Mike Parker, would you like to lead us into the next agenda item?
Sure, I can take it. Item number 3 is juvenile substance use disorder treatment. And this is being presented by Chris Cochran, Bellingham School District. Take us away, Chris.
Okay, sounds good. So am I able to share screen as far as we know?
Give me 1 second and I can make you a co-host.
Thanks, Jill. So when I, in these meetings, I'm always struck by the collective experience and wisdom and passion of the amount of people on this. So I feel like I learn a lot of new things in every meeting. So this topic around Bellingham schools and substance use treatment, obviously, because we're Bellingham Schools as an educational institution, we don't explicitly do substance use treatment, but I wanted to talk about the role of schools as an upstream factor in terms of preventing incarceration. So let me see, because that's our whole topic right now. Let me just, looks like it's gonna be hard for me to find the one thing that I'm wanting to look at. So I'm just gonna share my screen and then grab my PowerPoint. And then start from the beginning here. So because I'm sharing screen, I won't be able to see hands raised or things like that. So can you all see the screen okay?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, so wanted to go through and just provide some information on what we're doing now, what we've done in the past, what those changes have been like, and then some specific measures we have recently put in place to try and change outcomes for our students and families around this. So looking at the priorities for public schools, we have a number of mandates that are given to us and how we care for children and how we educate them, pre-K through 21 students. And so, of course, we have physical and emotional safety that we are tasked with. And then, of course, providing a learning environment that is that kids are able to learn in. And at the same time, we also need to advocate for individual students. So if a student's having a behavioral health crisis or substance use issues and ongoing things like that, sometimes, trying to provide physical and emotional safety for 25 kids when there's one or two in the classroom that are having some type of crisis can feel like they're in conflict, those two priorities. So, and then on top of that, we have, of course, federal services like special services, IEPs, and 504s that require us to make sure we're providing the appropriate services for that child specifically. And just highlighting that in a local parentis where schools are given really this mandate and responsibility to act as the parent when the parent has given us the privilege of caring for their child. And making those decisions of safety, but also needing to provide FAPE, which is free and appropriate public education for every student. Those are some of the main things that we're tasked with. We look at where we were a couple of years ago, and I say a couple meaning, let's say 6 to 8 years. In the last 6 to 8 years, we've had a number of significant changes in our discipline policies and other policies as well. So if you were going back that many years, I would say 5 to 8 years ago, if you were caught with some type of drug or alcohol substance on you in school, you would get suspended for 10 days, 10 to 15 days. And then if you can go, if you have parents or yourself can figure out how to go and get a substance use assessment and meet with somebody either at CCS or somewhere else, then that would get put down to 2 days, and you could return when you have evidence that you had that done. And usually it would come along with, say, a follow-up visit of some sort to them. And then looking at the behavioral side, where we had, say, either a mental health crisis or just some behavioral aggression. It was usually, for very minor cases, it could be a 3-day suspension, could be a 10-day suspension for something more significant. And for something really significant where there was either a weapon or not a weapon, but just significant aggression, it would be a 45-day suspension, especially if there was a pattern of behavior in that area. And then looking at BECA for truancy, BECA laws, we would send out a letter as a school 5 days in per school year, 7 days in, or 10 days. And of course, at 10 days, we're supposed to file a BECA petition with the court. As that school process takes hold at 10 days, it really keys in the legal process. And so we started looking at what those steps were in the process. And I'll talk more about that because we've done, I think, some good work in how we've revised that. So now we've gone from, say, drug and alcohol possession to, instead of a 10 and 2 or 15 and 2, it's really gone to a 1 day. We really focus on, like it says under behavior and aggression, on making sure that kids are not missing instruction, on reducing those days of missed instruction, even hours of missed instruction. So if we have somebody who has drug alcohol possession, generally they are either, we either have a conversation with them, and if they're able to return to class, then they do. If they're not able to return to class for a number of reasons, if they're under the influence or some other things that might be happening, then they'll come back the next day. Unless, if it was distribution, that changes the subject, and we'll have some other conversations, and that might include law enforcement depending on situation. We also have our prevention intervention specialists, which is a huge part of our system. As an educational system, we've got somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 employees that do a lot of different things. And of all those people in the district, we have our school counselors in each school. But beyond that, the only people that are specifically trained and focused on behavioral health are 3 prevention intervention specialists, and each one of them are located at each of our 3 big high schools. Bellingham and Option share one. And then we have 3 now new program. We have 3 mental health specialists, including myself and Laura Burke and Anna Rittmuller. So those are really the 6 people in our district that are specifically focused on behavioral health and supporting our schools with that. In terms of behavior aggression, again, we're looking at how can we reduce time that kids are out of school. So, and there's of course a lot of research and data around seeing that the more kids are out of school and then the more they're engaged in other systems, whether it's legal system or just at home or on the street, poorer outcomes in terms of being able to graduate and experience success in school. We also started, this happened about 8 or 10 years ago, started bringing a lot of restorative practices in, and that has been across the district, but it's also been localized where people got some training and felt like they had the tools to bring this in, they would start bringing it in. And I would say we're still on a slow roll with the restorative practices in terms of providing tools for people that are ready to use them. And on the flip side of that, we've also changed a number of our discipline policies to be much more oriented towards restorative practices. So even if an administrator doesn't necessarily feel as equipped to do that, our policies go in that direction anyhow. Here's a quick breakdown of restorative practices compared with traditional discipline. As you're looking through this, there are times when you either have some type of imminent danger, or you have whoever the student was that acted out may not be at all interested in restorative practices, and we still encourage that and we'll work with the student, but there are times when that is an important factor of the student's willingness to be part of the process. So it really focuses on the community, the victim. How do we encourage reciprocity in terms of repairing damage done? And then also healing that relationship so that the relationship is a key point of it, both between victim and person who acted out, but also between the administrator and the student. And then in terms of attendance policies, most of the laws are similar. Some of the things that have changed, the process that I talked about, the school process and the legal process, mostly similar to what they were, but there's less repercussions for students and parents, whereas maybe in the past there were fines or possible jail time in juvie, which really, I'm not aware of that ever happening in our district. That's not the case for us now at this point. We do have in the process some more evaluations that we try and do. Ironically, that becomes challenging if you have a student who is not showing up for school, and then on the first day they show up, you want to sit down with them and ask them a very long questionnaire. Sometimes it makes them not want to come back, so it's kind of a running joke about that. But I think the biggest changes for attendance policies have been how our front offices and schools approach kids and families. Instead of talking about why weren't you here and what's going on, and that may still happen to a certain extent when it's a strong pattern of behavior. But I think a lot of it is looking at what's going on, what are the obstacles, how can we help remove those obstacles, what can we support you with? Is it an alarm clock? Great. Is it a bus pass? Great. And then also looking at the steps in both the school process and the legal process and finding ways to positively engage families earlier. So instead of a truancy board, which is now called community engagement board, instead of that being step 8 out of 10, and that may be the first time that parents are able to have their concerns heard and feel like they had some collaboration, maybe we move that forward in the process so that it's step 3 instead of step 8. So there's some big changes there. As a system, we use a multi-tiered system of support, which is we use this with academics, with behavior, with attendance. And really it is that all kids, 100% of kids should experience tier 1. It's a universal thing. So social emotional learning curriculum in classes, or knowing who your school counselor is, or having access to the school counselor. 100% of kids have that. Tier 2, targeted interventions where you have specific kids might be meeting with that school counselor on a regular basis. It's not specific like a behavior plan or anything that's for that individual child, but it's just, it could be support groups, things like that. And tier 3 is really like an IEP or an individual behavior plan or some plan that is specific around that student's needs. We also focus on skill-based things that can be taught, because one thing we know is educators do really well with instruction. So anytime we can take behavioral health stuff, put it into instructional language, teachers do great with that. A couple other things that we have used in the recent years. I think Bellingham Schools has had a really positive relationship with Bellingham PD, and my experience as a school counselor has been really positive over the years. We are evolving that program to be more of a multidisciplinary team. So the DRO, district resource officers involved, but it might also be ourselves as mental health specialists. We might also enroll, call VS victim support services, DVSAS, like I have down at the bottom there. But we're looking at what's the best type of response for this particular need that comes up on a daily basis. And then, of course, the laws that we're all familiar with that we talk about in our meetings have impacted a lot of things, and that impacts us in the district as well. And then we're constantly working on, between law enforcement and schools, looking at system language and learning across systems so that we can work together. And so it's more integrated than it is attention there. Another big thing that has helped us as trauma-informed practices. So this is something we do a lot of training with our teachers. Right now, it tends to be on a voluntary, because teachers have so much on their plate. We will provide professional development opportunities around this often. So like this fall, we're going to do a book study on a new book by Bruce Perry, specifically related to this. So we've done several in last year. And the goal is to support teachers and other educators to be able to look at internal processes, like what's going on in the brain, what's going on in the physiology and the heart of that kiddo, versus just seeing the behavior. And also understanding more about, okay, if we want the child to be able to access the prefrontal cortex in math or English, what do we need to do to address needs in the limbic system in order for that to happen? And looking at regulation, helping the child regulate versus just compliance. We also are focused on collaborating with, so if Compass Mental Health is doing a great job meeting our kids' needs in the community, there's no reason for us to recreate a wheel that's already being done well. Like John Dukes at MCOT and I were talking the other day, and I know that they're struggling, like Ann mentioned, with a lot of things. One thing we are working together on is our suicide prevention protocol, integrating that with MCOT so that their work, they can help us and we can help them, since they're already serving a lot of our kids and families outside of school time. So we're working across systems to just try and make sure we're doing the best we can. And then the last piece is those systemic factors as a district, looking at EDI and figuring out, okay, how can we make sure that all of our students are having an equitable experience? People have the ability to, and some of these others were like representation, that when kids come to school, they have a way of feeling belonging and seeing themselves and the staff there, and equitable access to services as well. So looking at all of our 23 school sites and saying, hey, how are they able to access mental health over there versus over in this school? So, and then the last main thing I would say is, since COVID hit, we've really taken a huge look at how do we not only engage families, but how do we acknowledge families as the leaders in their own child's life? Because, you know, no matter how many letters and alphabet soup you have behind your name, that parent is always going to know their child better than I will. And how do we listen for those families' voice? So that's really, those are some major things that we're doing as a district to try and become more proactive as an upstream prevention element, in terms of where kids might normally get engaged in the legal system and then end up at juvie or later on in the jail. Our goal, of course, with our district resource officer on down to every educator, making sure that we're helping children navigate toward healthy systems, advocating for them, and all those those different areas. So that's all I have, and I will stop sharing and hand it back. But I love it. If I know we're at 15 minutes now, if we have any time for questions, love to hear people's ideas and questions.
Parker.
Chris, first off, thank you for that. That was a great coverage, and you've addressed an issue that I think has been burning, at least in the Behavioral Health Subcommittee, for a long time. I'm curious, I know that there was a lot of then and now, so I'm seeing a lot of changes, restorative practices, earlier intervention, possibly bringing that community engagement board earlier. I'm wondering if you have any statistics to share with us so far, or is it paying off as you hoped? Are all the changes pairing up? And then the other question, Chris, was, I heard you mention that trauma-informed care, for example, is optional as a professional development option for your educators. Is the school district looking at ensconcing that as kind of a required or base level?
Yeah. So your first question about, are we seeing results? I would say that one, obviously with COVID, it gets tricky, right? Because we just weren't seeing kids. And so like we talked about looked like referral rates with DV were going down, but we kind of knew intuitively they're probably high. I think that's where we've been as a system as well, not necessarily with DV, but with, all sorts of things that are risk factors for our kiddos. So we have seen a huge increase in students asking for mental health support in the last, even before COVID. So I think that's where our district has tried to be responsive. And just my position is new, right? I've only been in this position for about 18 months, not even, and our team is new for mental health. So they've been incredibly supportive as a district of pushing into that. We do have some data through Healthy Year Survey, through what our school counselors are saying, what parents are saying. I would say between parents' voices and our school counselors, those are the ones that I look at the healthy use surveys and things like that, but I listen to the school counselors and the parents the most because they're in all the schools hearing the kids. In terms of your other question about optional versus is this direction we're going, there is no, obviously as a large district, we have a ton of different initiatives always going at different times. In terms of behavioral health and social emotional learning, there is no more dominant paradigm than trauma-informed work. So I think we're offering it as a voluntary professional development for teachers so they can kind of dip their toe in as they feel comfortable because they're already overwhelmed with their job scope. But the plan and the work that we're doing is very directional. So we're moving in that direction. And the goal is just to build that knowledge base with people that are already interested. And then we also are doing some staff trainings at different schools where it's a whole staff. Like that.
Great. Other questions for Chris or comments? Rainey.
Chris, it's been enlightening on what is happening, and I appreciate you being here and participating. I do have a little bit of a question. You were talking about the brain functions and teaching that to the teachers and how to engage the kids. Is that a part of the education to the kids on brain functions and the drugs, or something that was brought up to one of my attentions, and I am not a medical professional at all, so I may be off on some of this, was the effect of marijuana use in youth and the amygdala and the flight and fight response, and how that impacts the child on making decisions that are very serious. And I was just curious, teaching the teachers, are we teaching the kids of the impacts of some of the choices that they may make that they don't realize that could impact them?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways a couple channels that's natural in. Elementary school counselors tend to have more time in their day where they're doing classroom instruction. So they're going to be doing things like you mentioned, which is wellness related and response, so prevention and responsive. So talking about things like how is our brain made up? What does it do when we practice deep breathing or we learn some skills that help us regulate versus what does it do when we make other decisions like substances and things like that? That also happens in health classes. So every high school health class has a mental health component, a couple units in that curriculum. It also has substance use units in that curriculum. We also have Mad Hope that comes into some of our classes when health teachers have time for that, and they can incorporate that in there. And then whenever I'm able to go out or we're able to go out as a team, I mean, that's just the Kool-Aid that I love to drink. So, I'm all over that. And I enjoy talking with anyone about that, just geeking out on it. But we will do, so in your question, do we share that with students? Like when I was working at Options for a number of years as a school counselor there, when we were first, ACEs has been around for a long time, adverse childhood experiences, and the research around that. When Paper Tigers came out as a movie, if you've seen that, we started looking at ways, and I worked with Amy Hockenberry at the health department on how we could share that with our students. We wanted to make sure we were sharing it in a productive way that didn't just leave them with something that wasn't useful. So we went into our health classes and we would share, here's the research on ACEs, here's what that looks like. We provided confidential ways for them to do an ACE survey if they wanted to. And then we would talk about resiliency and hope and how does somebody become agents of change? How do they take that pen in the story that's being written for them and start writing their own story? So I think there's several ways in our district where that happens. We do have social emotional curriculum that started in K-5 and is now we're adopting it in 6, 8, and 9, 12 as well. So.
Okay, other questions for Chris? Chris, I wanted to thank you. For those on the Legal and Justice Committee, you may be wondering why we're talking about juvenile wellness in a task force that works on adult incarceration. And we on the behavioral health side see the line between youth resiliency, preparation, supports, and preventing kids from, when they turn into an adult, showing up in our court system or in our jail. We want to prevent that as much as possible. So that's why I just really appreciate Chris's perspective. And so for similar reasons, I invited Brian Thane from the Housing Authority, because housing is such an integral part of what we do. So I hope that everyone sees the value in that. And I think we do need to move on. Chris, thank you. We just have about 12 minutes left here, it looks like, and I want to make sure we get to Heather Flaherty and the letter. This is item number 4, recommendations for American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA funding, and this is going to be led by Heather Flaherty.
Good afternoon, everybody. We started in the morning and it is now the afternoon. Chris, I just want to say that what you just said gave me chills about how we take the pen and the story that's being written for us and start writing our own story. And that work is so amazing that you're doing with our youth. And Dan, I appreciate you connecting it to what we want to prevent in the long run and how critical it is to start early on. So we have this opportunity right now as a county, as government, a local government, to look at the American Rescue Plan Act dollars that are coming to Whatcom. And Tyler Schroeder, deputy executive, came to one of our committee meetings, or maybe the task force meeting a couple months ago, and said, we'd love to get your input on where ARPA investments could go. A small group of the behavioral health committee met and talked through where we would recommend some investments. And we brought a draft to you today to review. Our hope is that this could go to the task force next week, and that the task force would endorse it, and that this could be an official letter from the Incarceration Prevention Reduction Task Force to County Council. And I see this as 2 opportunities, really. One is, I think that this is a very well thought out letter, very informed. I think we've touched on some of the issues today around workforce, and Raylene, some of your stories about where do we call to get the help for somebody who's not committing a crime. But it's also an opportunity for the task force to use our collective voice and to get the important issues out into the community and make sure community members are aware of what we think needs to happen, because ARPA is not the only resource out there to make investments. And so You have a draft in your email. I hope you've had a chance to review it. We don't have a ton of time to go through it. I think really the hope is that if you all are comfortable making a motion to advance this to the task force, that would be my ideal outcome out of this discussion. The top 4 areas that we've discussed at the Behavioral Health Committee a number of times and in that smaller funding subgroup are support for the behavioral health workforce, which I don't think I have to convince any of you that that's an issue right now in our community. Pretrial and reentry support, a 24/7 mental health urgent care model to help with that. Where are we diverting people to conversation? And then supported and transitional housing. And the letter goes through details of what the opportunities are around those areas and really ties it to what the ARPA funds are designed for. ARPA is out there to help mitigate the impacts of the pandemic, and you can make some pretty significant arguments that those 4 priorities, they are not the only priorities in the community, but these 4 continue to come up in all of the conversations as barriers to the goals we have. And you can make the argument that they're very much tied to and have been exacerbated by the effects of the pandemic. So, I guess thoughts, questions? And for the people who helped with this letter, anything you want to add?
I would just add that this is a procedural and process request, that this goes to the task force for the task force's consideration. So I just want to make sure everyone understands what the ask is here, and I will entertain a motion. Moonwater.
So just briefly to name here, and then perhaps I can name it later. I'm hoping that this letter moves forward, and thank you all for the work that you put into it. Wearing my longstanding nonprofit community partner hat, hearing the conversation about DV today, hearing the conversation about the different ways that we're supporting youth in our community and through our schools with restorative practices and social emotional learning and so forth. The Dispute Resolution Center intersects in each one of those conversations in different ways. And I just want to name that as an example of a community-based nonprofit organization that can support the various conversations and prevention efforts that we're trying to achieve. And the impacts of the pandemic on the DRC and organizations like us have been profound. And I am anticipating that we are going to see and continue to see significant impacts in the coming years in our nonprofit workforce. And so when we talk about behavioral workforce, one of the questions that came up for me is whether or not there's room in there or as a subsection or unique section within the letter to acknowledge the need to invest in nonprofit social service partner infrastructure, basic operating costs. These funds, as I'm aware, these funds are going to be available for multi-years, and nonprofits need unrestricted multi-year operational funds in order to continue doing the good work that we're doing in the community that tie directly to the work of this task force. And there are many nonprofits, there are many of us in the community. So I just want to put that plug in as a way to tie the work that we're trying to achieve to specific nonprofits or general nonprofits in Whatcom County that are walking alongside government as community partners to address these very issues. And that there needs to be more than simply project-based funding available for our nonprofit communities. So I'll just name that. I fully support this letter moving forward and would love to see some additional prioritization for nonprofit capacity.
Before I go to Mr. Gockley, Heather, did you want to respond to that?
I'm just taking notes right now.
Okay.
And I think that's a really good point, Moonwater. We do have a section in here I neglected to mention additional priorities, and it could fit really well into that additional priorities section where we call out the need for more youth mental health support and for data infrastructure generally. And as long as we have this platform for advocacy, we wanted to make sure that those were elevated as well, and the nonprofit capacity could fit really well into that.
Stephen.
Oh, excuse me, my phone's going. These are really questions, Heather. First is procedural. I haven't had a chance to look at it, but Jill put out the agenda already for next week's task force meeting. It's a full one, and really top priority issues. Dr. Harris from UW on data issues and the discussion on the recent law enforcement legislative changes. So the idea of pushing another really important discussion into that agenda causes me some concern. And I just want to say that for maybe a timing question. The other is, for the first time today, through Ann, I guess, I heard that we're experiencing a pretty significant and pretty key gap in an ART kind of response situation, non-emergent, non-behavioral health, but it's really stymieing our ability to respond to on-the-ground occurrences every day throughout the county. So I don't see that addressed in the recommendations of the letter. I think everything that's in the letter is really well thought out, and as you said, shows up all the time in our discussion as key barriers to be addressed. But I'm just wondering if there might be some more thought to go into this sort of new breaking development that's probably going to be changing over the next couple months, and you know, how we want to wrap that information into possible recommendations.
Before I recognize Ms. Deacon and Feld, Heather, do you want to respond real quick?
I think that could fit into potentially the workforce section as an emerging opportunity. And my hope is that there's just ongoing dialogue because things change constantly. So yes, Stephen. And the other thing I want to say is timing is important on the other side as well, because decisions are being made about ARPA funds. So if we don't get something out there about what's important, I guess I'm a fan of incrementalism at this point over nothing. So I understand the agenda issue too, but I don't want to not have a voice in that arena and have ARPA priorities be determined without our input.
Okay, and we are at 1 o'clock. I'm wondering, I want to call a vote on this. Well, first I need a motion to call the vote and a second, and we need to have a quorum. Who's the motion?
Mike Parker, so moved.
Okay.
Second.
Okay, motion's been made and seconded. Further discussion, Ann Deacon, then Arlene Feld.
The county executive has already put in a significant amount of money from ARPA in his recommendations for that alternative response team. And the city is also very dedicated to that. So I think we're in good shape.
I just want to chime in real quick. The 838,000 for the ART. I don't even think we need to go into ARPA on the city side. Our general fund's very healthy. Arlene Feld. You're muted, ma'am.
I was just supporting what Heather said about timing. These decisions are being made immediately, and it's very important for the list of what we're interested in supporting, that it get in to the county council and the executive. Yes.
Okay. I want to call the vote. We're at 1:01 right now, and I want to respect people's time. We still have another, at least one more agenda item that Under Sheriff Chadwick will provide. Okay, so motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed?
Aye.
Abstention? Okay, I hear no abstentions. I hear no opposition. So this letter is going to go forward to the task force. Congratulations, Heather. Nice work. Okay, let me just get us back on track here. Behavioral health, item number 5 is behavioral health provider ride along with law enforcement, and Under Sheriff Chadwick is here to present.
Well, good afternoon. I'll try and talk fast because I know everybody's got other things on their agenda today. I was asked just to start the discussion about behavioral health riding along with law enforcement. Obviously, within the Behavioral Health Subcommittee, we've been having discussions for probably better part of a year about alternative responses, co-responder models, what works best, and quite frankly, what works in Bellingham might not be the best solution for rural Whatcom County or other jurisdictions within the county. So looking at different options, I know within Bellingham, the alternative unarmed response right now is looking more like behavioral health clinicians and EMT or some kind of medical personnel to address mental health and medical issues. In the county, and this kind of dovetails into what Ann alluded to, that they're with Compass Health and MCOT, who we utilize in the county via the sheriff's office. Our behavioral health deputies utilize both MCOT and Grace, but they really are kind of our go-to to get clinicians out in the field to try and assist people that maybe aren't to that involuntary status where we would be taking them to the hospital or another facility. So really what we've discussed is having a behavioral health clinician riding alongside with one of our behavioral health deputies. Currently, we have 2 behavioral health deputies that prioritize calls for service. And then, we could also have them riding with other people. I know there's potentially some funding out there to fund these. And I think, quite frankly, for, and I don't want to speak for NCOT, I know John Dukes has been on here before, but as we were looking at different alternative approaches, alternative dispatch to dealing with behavioral health calls, safety was always an issue. So we want to make sure that, anybody that's responding out there feels safe and that they're able to do what they need to do and provide the services where people are. And I think if we kind of model it, currently Skagit County has the Impact Program, which Compass Health is using in their MCOT team, and they partnered with Skagit County deputies, and they're actually riding with them, which provides an immediate response from a behavioral health clinician, but also provides some of that that safety component that I think we're hearing from a lot of the mental health professionals, especially when they're farther out in the county and maybe a law enforcement response, if they needed to call some, was delayed, that they would have that person there. And then depending on the situation, the law enforcement officer could step back and let that behavioral health clinician do their job and what their specialty is. So that's something that I know we've talked about before. We would currently, obviously support that at the sheriff's office. I think that's as far as a co-responder model probably works better in the more remote areas of Whatcom County to provide those services where people are. And just to clarify, I know there's been discussion, and obviously when we were contemplating this program with the legislative changes, we weren't sure what that was going to look like or if that was even possible. And just to clarify, these legislative changes don't say that law enforcement can't respond to mental health calls, and the sheriff's office still does, as do all other law enforcement agencies. But we do have now a duty of reasonable care where we have to look at different alternatives, and we need to use time, distance. We need to call on behavioral health specialists. And then one of the things, if there's no crime being committed or there's no immediate threat to any persons, to include the person in crisis, one of the options that law enforcement is supposed to exercise is that we should leave the scene. But it's, and those are some of the conversations we've had with our legislators, and they've heard our concerns, and the concerns, quite frankly, from EMTs, firefighters, mental health professionals that feel now they're on some of these calls and don't have that safety because we either left or we didn't respond to begin with. So again, I would certainly support something similar to the Impact Program that's in Skagit County. I think between that partnership, they're currently saying they respond to about 50 calls a week between that co-responder of the MCOT member as well as the deputy.
And Deacon?
We heard that loud and clear, Doug, and we have put in a bid for that money from the regional ASO, the Administrative Service Organization. So I think at this point, it's a matter of just implementing it, getting that money into contract with Compass and Compass Health finding the personnel, but it's well supported and the region is aware of it.
Very good.
Other questions or comments for Under Sheriff Chadwick? Okay. I'm wondering if we can take this back, this discussion. This is a bigger discussion with that impact program. I'd like to learn a little bit more about that and maybe have this discussion in our behavioral health subcommittee. Does that sound all right? Okay.
I actually have a PowerPoint on the impact program that I can share with the group.
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be great. If you can get that over to Jill, and then maybe we can have a discussion in our subcommittee meeting. Okay, hold on. We're 8 minutes over. We still have other items here, task force communications. I'm wondering if we could take these back to our subcommittees and discuss them in behavioral health and legal and justice separately.
Yes, item 6 can be put off to a later date.
Okay, great. Any other business before I go to public comment? Seeing none. Jill?
Thank you. We have 4 attendees at the meeting today. If any of you would like to speak to the committee, please virtually raise your hand now. No hands are raised.
Okay. Hey, everyone, just thanks for coming today and thanks for staying over. Really appreciate it. And I think these joint committee meetings are very useful twice a year. Is everyone okay with continuing on with this? Or are we at four times a year or just twice a year? 4 times. Okay. Okay. Are people okay with that? Raylene, go ahead.
I just wanted to state that we had changed that to 4 times.
Thanks. Yeah, every one of us have been in so many Zoom meetings over the past 18 months. It gets blurry. So thanks for accommodating, and thank you all, and have a good rest of your day. We are adjourned.